I have degrees in environmental studies and political science, so it's pretty interdisciplinary. I like to say that the umbrella topic for all of my research is knowledge mobilization for sustainability. So that means that I'm interested in taking research, evidence, knowledge that we do have, usually within universities, and moving it to where it can be most useful. So that can be moving it to the public to inform public debates, educate the public, or move it to government, have it be used in policy decisions. So there's a couple of different parts of that research. One is, how can we make our research more useful? Can we do interdisciplinary and team-based work so that the knowledge we create is more applicable to the audiences we're interested in? And then, of course, there's all sorts of complicated dynamics around actually trying to translate or transfer some of that knowledge to those realms, because the members of the public and policymakers, they're not always interested in getting additional information. There's a lot of information out there already, so we can't assume that either. So it gets pretty complicated, but I'm excited about it. I think it's interesting. This is a bit of a jargony term that we use in a variety of the fields that I'm involved with. And essentially it's a catch-all term to refer to all the potential relationships between scientists and policymakers, whether that's decision makers or civil servants. And it's even broader than that. It can include other researchers, social scientists, humanists. A lot of the same stuff will apply. But what's really interesting about the literature around science policy interfaces is that it's very good at observing the differences between these two realms or these two spheres, almost calling them different communities or different cultures and having different languages. So there's different priorities in terms of scientists. It takes us longer to do research. The sorts of questions that we're asking are sort of based on our academic curiosity. And if you compare that to policymakers, things need to be happening quickly, and they have an agenda that is set by their mandate and by the public. So those are the sorts of tensions that come up when you try to do this sort of knowledge mobilization to government and engage in partnerships. There's a sense in the climate science and climate advocacy communities that there's a gap between what we know, the scientific consensus, and the resulting policy action. And I felt that same frustration, or have identified that same gap. So that's what motivated my own research, was to basically delve into the science policy interface in some areas and tease that out, right? Why is there a noticeable gap between the scientific consensus and the resulting policy action? And it turns out it's a little more complicated than just saying, hey, there's a gap and policymakers are failing. But essentially what I did was I looked at existing relationships between climate science organizations and climate policy agencies and tried to see what's working, what's going on there, what's effective, are the ways that they're setting up those relationships leading to different outcomes, what kinds of variables predict the success of these variety of types of different relationships. And I learned quite a bit there in terms of taking some time to establish trust between the two agencies, the difference between levels of government. It seems like these sorts of relationships have better outcomes and are a little easier at lower levels of government. But there's a number of outcomes there, but it has to do with science policy interfaces because I was looking at climate science policy relationships. So there are a few different outcomes from my PhD research that have answers to that question. One is that it really depends on the sort of policy context that the university, department, or institute that we're talking about is dealing with. So if you're a climate science organization and the government of the day is really hostile to climate action, it's going to be a lot more difficult for you to engage in a relationship with that particular government. So there's a difference there, and basically what I've suggested with one of my frameworks is that if the policy context is favorable, then you probably can engage in a direct relationship, and if it's unfavorable, your options are pretty much limited to building broader networks and educating or advocating to the public to try to put indirect pressure on that policy agency. The other outcome that's interesting is something I put together, which is basically an argument for why governments should be interested in these sorts of partnerships with researchers, because there are a number of short-term benefits that accrue to governments when they engage that have nothing to do with changing their policy based on the information that they're getting. So in that way, I hoped to increase the number of relationships that might be occurring. Well, there are lots of really interesting energy-related debates and discussions happening around Newfoundland and Labrador right now. There's Muskrat Falls, offshore wind, there's biomass and fossil fuel discussions going on, and in Nova Scotia, there's talks about tidal energy. So for me, these are opportunities for me to examine the role of the academic expert in all of these debates. So how have academics, scientists, and others engaged in these debates? How could they engage in these debates? What roles are acceptable to the public and to policymakers? What are the perceptions of the experts that are engaging in these debates? And that's a really interesting question when it comes to knowledge mobilization, because it'll tell us a little bit about what's appropriate in terms of how we use our research with the public and with government, and so that we're not stepping on people's toes when we try to be useful. And it will draw on a really interesting theoretical area called deliberative democracy, which basically holds that thoughtful and authentic communication between all the parties involved will lead to better policy outcomes. One exception to that, and this is true of everybody, is that I'll probably find that I moved my hands more than I thought I did, and more than I would have liked, but I'm actually I'm kind of anchored in here, right? If I was standing, I'd be...
And your hands are also kind of below the...
Oh, okay, so you sometimes see me move.
You sometimes see them emerge from the thing, but...